Welcome to Starbound. If you're sick of AI-generated slop and want real human storytelling, please subscribe to support this channel. My name's Aram, I'll be your narrator. Let's get into the story. Dying empires made for the best garage sales. That was the first thought in Chuck Val's head as he threaded his freighter, the Lucky Bastard, through the glittering graveyard of what used to be the Athelian Imperial Fleet's finest dreadnought. Twisted metal spun in a silent, deadly ballet across the starfield. Hulls were peeled back like citrus rind. Frozen command bridges glittered with ice crystals where the atmosphere had explosively vented, and the ghosts of energy weapon scars still glowed with a faint, residual heat. His kinetic barriers warped the light around the ship, deflecting the larger chunks of debris, but the constant, high-velocity spray of micrometeoroids and ionized particles was sandblasting the hull plating with the sound of 1,000 tiny needles. Kinetic barriers are holding at 70%, but they cannot stop the particle abrasion. A calm, synthesized voice announced from the cockpit speakers. Structural integrity is at 89% and dropping. This reminds me of the flawed Terran business model of loss leaders, which historically led to a 93% failure rate for startup companies attempting to penetrate established markets. Relax, Lucky, Chuck said, his hands moving on the controls to nudge the ship around a particularly large piece of armor plating that tumbled end over end. A few scratches builds character. My character is a state-of-the-art stochastic personality network. It requires no building, only routine maintenance, which you have neglected for the last 3 rotations. I'll run a full diagnostic when we get paid. This haul should cover it and then some. He gestured with his chin toward a mangled section of the Dreadnought's superstructure, its command tower sheared clean off in a jagged wound of melted metal. Scan that section over there. Looks like part of the command deck. That's where they keep the expensive toys. Scanning, Lucky replied with the audible equivalent of an eye roll. The ship's external sensors painted a wireframe model on the main screen, highlighting points of interest. Detecting trace life signs. Faint. Athelian. Chuck's hands froze on the controls. Survivor? No way. That thing blew apart hours ago. The lifeboats would be long gone. My senses are rarely mistaken, unlike my pilot's sense of self-preservation. Furthermore, incoming energy signatures match an Athelian patrol squadron. Estimated time of arrival, 12 minutes. 12 minutes? Chuck's initial caution evaporated, replaced by the familiar, reckless thrill of a calculated risk. The promise of high-grade salvage was now mixed with a potent dose of morbid curiosity. Plenty of time for a little humanitarian rescue, and by humanitarian rescue, I mean looting. I have already logged your highly predictable and morally questionable intentions, Lucky said. Docking clamps engaged. Please try not to get us killed. When have I ever gotten us killed? Chuck asked, grabbing his helmet from its rack and sealing it with a satisfying hiss of compressed air. Statistically, it is only a matter of time. The inside of the wrecked command deck was a cathedral of destruction. Emergency lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across twisted bulkheads and the floating bodies of Athelian officers, their silver and black uniforms stark against the carnage. The air, thin and cold, was thick with the scent of superheated polymers and ionized metal. The only sound was the deep groan of stressed metal settling in the cold and the heavy thud of Chuck's magnetic boots on the deck plating. He swept his flashlight across the carnage, the beam illuminating a scene of calculated violence. Plasma scoring was concentrated on consoles and command chairs. This was no random battle. It was a surgical assassination, designed to decapitate the fleet's command structure in a single, brutal stroke. Anything good, Lucky? He muttered into his comm, his voice a low hum inside his helmet. Several intact data terminals, encrypted with Athelian military-grade ciphers. Breaking them would be trivial for me,
but time-consuming for you. I am also detecting a high-value energy source consistent with a command-level personal sidearm."
Now we're talking. He followed the signal, his boots crunching over shattered viewscreen glass. He stepped carefully over a corpse whose face was a mask of surprise, forever frozen in the instant of betrayal. He saw her. She was slumped against a shattered command console, her black armor cracked like porcelain. A wicked piece of shrapnel was embedded in her side, a pool of dark, viscous violet spreading slowly across the deck in the low gravity. Her helmet was gone, revealing a face of sharp, aristocratic beauty, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and raven black hair plastered to her forehead with sweat and blood. Her gloved hand was inching, millimeter by millimeter, toward a plasma pistol just out of reach. He also noted a sleek vibroblade strapped to her boot, its hilt worn smooth from countless hours of practice. A professional's weapon. Stunning. Absolutely, breathtakingly, get-you-killed gorgeous. Chuck froze. Every instinct screamed at him. The smart move was to grab the pistol, the knife, and leave. A live Athelian, especially an officer from the looks of her uniform's cut, was more trouble than a whole cargo bay of stolen tech. She was the enemy, part of the Imperial machine that made his life as a freighter captain a constant game of cat and mouse.
"Patrol is now 9 minutes out."
Lucky's voice chirped in his ear, devoid of emotion.
"I suggest prioritizing self-interest over your latent hero complex, which has a historical success rate of approximately 41% in similar narrative scenarios."
He looked at her, at the fierce, stubborn spark in her eyes that refused to be extinguished even as her life bled out onto the deck. He saw the way her jaw was clenched against the pain, the sheer willpower keeping her conscious. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror, on his worst days. Damn it, Chuck sighed. The universe had a sick sense of humor. He holstered his own weapon and knelt beside her. Her eyes, a startling shade of deep amethyst, tracked him, narrowed with a potent mixture of suspicion and hate.
"Easy there, soldier,"
he said, his voice tinny through the helmet speaker.
"Looks like you've had a bad day."
She didn't respond, her gaze unwavering. He reached for the shrapnel, and her hand twitched, a clear warning.
"Look,"
he said, holding his hands up in a placating gesture.
"I can leave you here to become ship decor, or you can let me pull this thing out so you don't bleed out before your friends get here. Your call."
For a long moment, she just stared, the faint flicker of the emergency lights reflecting in her deep violet eyes. He could see the calculation happening, the lifetime of military discipline warring with the basic animal instinct to survive. Then, a short, imperceptible nod.
"All right, this is gonna hurt like a motherfucker."
He gripped the jagged metal and pulled. A choked gasp escaped her lips, her body arching in agony, but she didn't scream. He pressed a wad of medical sealant from his belt against the wound. It was a temporary fix at best.
"Chuck,"
Lucky said, an uncharacteristic edge in its synthesized voice.
"Patrol is 6 minutes out. We are out of time."
Chuck looked from the bleeding Athelian to the exit. He could still make it. Richer, safer. He could be halfway across the sector before the patrol even realized what he'd taken. Son of a bitch, he muttered, scooping her up into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but dense, all coiled muscle under the shattered armor. Her hand lolled against his chest, the plasma pistol on the floor and the blade on her boot, forgotten in the adrenaline-fueled rush to escape. As he carried her back toward the airlock, she stirred, her lips moving silently. He leaned his helmet closer to hear. "Traitor," she whispered, a single word filled with venom, before finally succumbing to the darkness. "You and me both, lady," Chuck grunted, hauling her through the airlock of the lucky bastard. Back aboard his ship, the situation went from bad to worse. The Athelian was dying on his medbay cot. The ship's diagnostic scanner, which he jury-rigged from 3 different manufacturers' parts, was flashing a dozen angry red warnings.
Her cellular structure is degrading,
Lucky announced from the medbay speaker.
Athelian physiology is highly regulated. The trauma has caused a cascading systemic failure. Her cobalt-based blood is incompatible with our iron-based medical supplies.
Incompatible? What does that even mean? Chuck demanded, ripping open his primary medkit.
It means your collagens would induce catastrophic cellular agglutination. In layman's terms, if you use that kit on her, you will kill her faster.
Chuck stared at the woman on the cot. Her skin, a pale moon-white color, was taking on a grayish tint. Her breathing was shallow. He'd dragged her all the way here just to watch her die. That didn't sit right. He paced the small medbay, his magnetic boots clanking on the deck. His eyes landed on a sealed military-grade case tucked away in the back, something he'd lifted from a derelict explorer vessel years ago. An emergency deep space survival kit. He ripped it open. Inside, nestled in foam, was a single auto-injector filled with a fluid that swirled with captured light, a miniature galaxy in a vial. "Universal Cellular Repair Nanites," Chuck read from the label. "Autonomous programming. Caution, requires significant bioelectric energy to initialize when interfacing with unknown biology."
We do not have an Athelian-compatible power source for that kind of initialization,
Lucky pointed out, its tone suggesting the matter was closed. "No," Chuck said, a crazy, desperate idea forming in his mind, born from a half-remembered lecture on xenobiology he'd once overheard in a smuggler's den. "We don't." He looked from the vial to his own arm. What happens when you mix cobalt and iron at a molecular level? A violent exothermic reaction. A biological bomb. But what if you could harness that bomb? What if you could use the fire to forge a key?
Chuck, your logic is fundamentally flawed,
Lucky stated.
Introducing your blood into her system will be a catastrophic poison.
"I know," Chuck said, grabbing a sterile syringe. "I'm not trying to treat her. I'm trying to give the nanites a jump start, a lightning strike to get the engine running." He pushed up his sleeve, found a vein, and drew a syringe full of his own bright red blood. He didn't approach her IV line. Instead, with a surgeon's care he didn't know he possessed, he carefully injected his blood directly into the nanite auto-injector's vial. The silver fluid roiled, swirling with the crimson, turning a turbulent, stormy gray. He was priming the charge. He pressed the injector to the Athelian's neck and fired the cocktail into her system. For a second, nothing happened. Then her body seized, arching off the cot in a violent convulsion that made the metal frame groan. Alarms shrieked from the medical monitor, a dozen flatlines suddenly spiking into jagged, chaotic peaks. A faint shimmer of heat radiated from her skin, the air above her distorting.
Her core temperature is spiking. The reaction is out of control.
"Hold on!" Chuck yelled, more to himself than the AI, his hands hovering uselessly over her. He watched, helpless, as the battle raged inside her at a microscopic level. It was a war of incompatible biologies, with the nanites acting as battlefield commanders, fueled by the explosive energy of the conflict. He could almost feel the heat from across the room. The grayish tint of her skin receded, replaced by a flush of pale life. The jagged edges of the wound knitted together, the bleeding slowing to a sluggish ooze. Her breathing deepened, catching in a ragged hitch before evening out. The alarms on the monitor quieted, their frantic beeping replaced by a slow, steady pulse. It was the stupidest, most dangerous thing he'd ever done, and it had worked. The gash on her side was still open, though. He grabbed a roll of industrial-grade sealant tape from his toolkit. It was designed to patch hole breaches in a vacuum. It would have to do. He tore off a strip and pressed it firmly over the wound. It looked absurd, a crude patch on her otherwise perfect porcelain skin.
Patrol is entering the debris field,
Lucky warned.
They are hailing us.
Don't answer! Get us out of here now! Chuck yelled, sprinting for the cockpit. And find the quietest, darkest hole in this sector to hide in.
Plotting a course for unwise decisions and future regrets,
Lucky replied dryly.
Engaging jump drive.
The ship lurched, and the starfield dissolved into a smear of psychedelic light. She woke up with the speed and silence of a predator. One moment, Chuck was slumped in the pilot's chair, nursing a mug of lukewarm synth coffee, the exhaustion of the last few hours finally setting in. The next, a cold, sharp pressure was against his throat. A vibroblade, humming with deadly energy, was pressed just firmly enough to make its point. The knife from her boot. He'd been a damn fool. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice was a low, melodic contralto, holding all the warmth of deep space. "Guy who just saved your life," Chuck said, trying to sound casual as his heart hammered against his ribs. "Name's Chuck Val. You can thank me later, preferably after you move the pointy thing away from my carotid artery." "You are a human scavenger, a bottom feeder." "I do happen to like bottoms," he quipped. "Now, about that knife." She ignored him, his pathetic joke apparently going over her head. "I am Commander Fiona Vendetta of the Aethelian Imperial Fleet, commanding officer of the dreadnought Vindicator," she announced, her voice dripping with ice. "And you, Chuck Val, are my prisoner." The name landed in his gut with the weight of a dropped anvil. Commander Fiona Vendetta. The Iron Vendetta. He'd heard the name whispered in terrified tones in every port on the fringe. The architect of the Aethelian blockade that had been systematically trying to ruin his life for years. Before he could formulate a suitably sarcastic reply, Lucky's voice cut through the tension.
"Warning. Aethelian warship dropping out of hyperspace. It is the Retribution. They are hailing us."
Fiona's eyes widened, a flicker of something other than cold fury in their depths. "The Retribution? That's Godwin's ship." "Who's Godwin?" "My second in command," she snarled, and the pieces clicked into place with a sickening clarity. "Looks like your boy is here to finish the job," Chuck said. "And we're the only loose end." The blade at his throat vanished. She was at the co-pilot station in a flash, her eyes scanning the readouts, her movements smooth and lithe despite her injuries. "Take evasive action," she commanded, her tone shifting instantly from captor to commander. "I don't take orders on my own ship, lady."
"Their forward batteries are locking on,"
Lucky informed them.
"The probability of surviving a direct hit is 0.02%. Approximately the same chance the Terran Corporation Quasar Cola had of outselling water."
"Okay, I'm taking suggestions," Chuck yelled, slamming his hands on the controls. The ship veered sharply to starboard, a lance of crimson plasma searing the space where they had been a moment before.
"Their targeting solution is predictive,"
Fiona shouted, her eyes fixed on the approaching warship.
"Your flight patterns are erratic, but follow standard human evasive maneuvers. Induce a full lateral spin now. Be more chaotic."
"Chaotic is my middle name," Chuck grunted, yanking the stick hard to port, sending them into a gut-wrenching spiral that made the inertial dampeners whine in protest.
"They're compensating,"
she yelled over the scream of the engines.
"Aethelian targeting sensors have a minimum effective range, a close-range blind spot. Get inside it! Get under their belly!
Oh, this is a terrible idea.
Probability of survival if we do not, 0.01%.
Lucky added helpfully. Fine! Chuck roared, pushing the throttle forward. The lucky bastards screamed toward the Athelian warship, a gnat charging a leviathan. Plasma fire bloomed all around them, close enough to make the hull plating groan. He saw the opening she was talking about, a sliver of space beneath the massive forward cannons where the targeting arcs couldn't converge. He fired the ventral thrusters, flipping his ship end over end, and dove under the warship's belly, scraping so close he could see the individual rivets on its hull.
Jump drive is charged,
Lucky announced, its voice as calm as ever. Do it! Chuck and Fiona yelled in unison. The stars outside bled into streaks of light once more. The silence in the cockpit was heavier than a neutron star. They were safe, for the moment, drifting in an uncharted nebula whose swirling gases painted the viewport in hues of magenta and gold. Okay, Chuck said, breaking the quiet as he ran a shaky hand through his hair. New ground rules. Fiona turned to face him, her amethyst eyes cold and assessing.
There are no rules. You are a human criminal. I am an Athelian commander.
Yeah, well, right now we're two enemies on the same most wanted list. Chuck shot back, getting to his feet. So, here's the deal. You know I'm a smuggler. If your people catch me, I get spaced. Slowly. He took a step closer, crowding her space. But I know you're alive. I know your own second-in-command is hunting you. If you report me, you report yourself. Guardman will paint you as a traitor who fled with a human terrorist. Your precious honor will be dust. The war behind her eyes was visible, a tangible force. Her rigid Athelian sense of duty was locked in a death grip with the cold, hard logic of survival. Her jaw was a tight line, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the console.
We have reached a state of mutually assured destruction,
she said, her voice tight.
a stalemate.
Exactly. Chuck grinned, feeling a sliver of control return. My favorite kind of negotiation.
A statistical analysis of your current heart rate indicates a 68% probability of one of you murdering the other within the next operational rotation.
Lucky chimed in.
I would advise against it. The cockpit is difficult to clean.
Fiona let out a frustrated hiss, a sound like tearing silk.
What do you want, human?
I want to know who Guardwin is working with. This smells bigger than a simple mutiny. You help me figure that out, and I help you get somewhere safe so you can plan your glorious, vengeful comeback. Then we go our separate ways.
And why should I trust you?
Because you have no one else, Chuck said simply. And because right now, I'm the only one who knows you're not a monster. She flinched, a barely perceptible reaction, but he saw it.
I am a soldier of the Athelian Empire.
Yeah, I've heard the stories. The Iron Vendetta. Ruthless, Chuck said, his voice softening slightly. But I also saw you trying to make one last stand on a dead ship when you could have just given up. Whatever else you are, you're not a coward. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. A flicker of vulnerability crossed her features before being ruthlessly extinguished by years of command discipline.
We need information,
she said, her voice all business again.
Godwin is ambitious, but not creative. He would have used a neutral location to coordinate his conspiracy.
Chuck's grin returned, wide and predatory. Neutral, untraceable location, full of spies, info-brokers, and scum? I know just the place. Port Nowhere was a hollowed-out asteroid city, a nexus of illegal trade bathed in the perpetual twilight of holographic advertisements and flickering neon signs. The air in the central cantina, the glitch, was a thick soup of smells. The chemical tang from a faulty sign, the sweet rot of spilled alien liquor, and the sharp, spicy scent from a vendor's grill frying something with too many legs.
"This is your solution?"
Fiona asked, her voice a low murmur. She wore a hooded cloak but moved with a military stiffness that screamed off-worlder.
"This den of filth."
Hey, one man's den of filth is another man's networking event, Chuck replied, guiding her to a booth in the back, away from the main thoroughfare. The table was sticky with rings from previous drinks. My contact is an info broker named Glix. Looks like a melted candle. Morals of a starving shark. Perfect. Just try to act casual.
Define casual.
Yeah, don't stand like you're about to order a firing squad. Loosen up. She attempted a smile. It looked more like she was baring her teeth before a kill. Okay, maybe just try to blend, Chuck amended. Trouble found them instantly. A massive, heavily augmented bounty hunter named Hask blocked their path, his cybernetic arms whirring softly as they calibrated.
"Chuck Val,"
he boomed, his voice a gravelly rumble that cut through the cantina's din.
"You've got a hell of a price on your head."
Hask! Good to see you, you big lug.
"I'm going to enjoy this."
He lunged. Chuck kicked the table up. It slammed into the bounty hunter's chest with a crack of synthwood. The bar exploded into a whirlwind of motion. Thugs and opportunists surged forward, drawn by the premise of blood or credits. Chuck fought dirty, a chaotic brawler using anything he could grab. A bottle, a chair, a protesting alien patron. Then Fiona moved. A thug came at her with a knife. She sidestepped, a fluid, easy motion. Her hand shot out, a rigid spear-like strike to a nerve cluster at the base of his neck. He crumpled without a sound. She used Hask's momentum against him, redirecting a punch from one of his mechanical arms into his own friend, then disabling the arm with a lethal, lightning-fast strike to an exposed hydraulic joint in his elbow. They ended up back to back, a circle of groaning bodies around them.
"Not bad,"
Chuck panted, a wild grin on his face. For someone who doesn't know how to be casual.
"Tactical application of force is a universal language,"
she replied, her breathing barely elevated. He saw a flicker of something new in her eyes. Respect.
"Your style is unorthodox."
Thanks. I call it panicked flailing. They fought their way out of the cantina and back toward the docking bay. As they rounded a corner, Fiona held up a data chip she deftly lifted from Glix's pocket during the chaos.
"He was broadcasting his transaction logs on an open channel. Arrogant fool. The data points to a shell corporation working through the Viscar Mercantile Syndicate."
Chuck felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's spotty life support. The Viscar? The war profiteers?
"It seems my Athelian traitor and your galactic arms dealers have found common ground,"
Fiona said grimly.
Hask has sealed the hangar doors.
Lucky announced over their private comms.
His exact words were, "You're not getting away this time, you son of a glitches."
Glitches? He needs to work on his insults, Chuck muttered. Fiona, find me a weak point in those doors. Lucky, prep the jump drive for a blind ignition. The blind jump was rough, tossing them out of hyperspace into a violently radioactive stellar nursery. Young, brilliant blue stars bathed the cockpit in harsh light. Alarms blared, a symphony of failure.
"Plasma conduit overload!"
Lucky shouted, its synthesized voice strained.
"Engine room is venting superheated plasma."
"I'm on it!" Chuck yelled, sprinting from the cockpit. The engine room was a sweltering hell. The deck plates vibrated with the engine's distress, making his teeth ache. The air was so hot it tasted of metal. Chuck stripped to a grease-smeared tank top. A hairline crack in the main plasma conduit was spewing incandescent blue energy, painting the room in a deadly light. Lucky, I need to cycle the plasma flow, but it's going to cause a feedback loop unless someone holds this bypass clamp in place manually.
I will assist,
Fiona's voice said from the doorway. She stepped into the inferno without hesitation, her face set. Get on that side, Chuck ordered, handing her a pair of insulated gloves. Squeeze this clamp like your life depends on it, because it does. She took her position opposite him. The space was cramped. She had to lean in close, her shoulder almost brushing his. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, see the sweat beading on her temples. He fired up the welder, the hiss of the tool adding to the cacophony.
Your methods are primitive,
she commented, her voice strained as she fought to hold the clamp steady.
Athelian ships use self-sealing conduits.
Yeah, well, this primitive bucket of bolts just saved your life again. Chuck grunted, sweat dripping into his eyes and blurring his vision. He could feel her eyes on him. He risked a glance up from the glowing seam of the weld. She was looking at him, and the muscles in his back and shoulders straining with the effort. There was a strange, focused intensity in her gaze he hadn't seen before. Not command, not anger, but something else entirely.
Environmental controls are failing.
Lucky's voice crackled.
I suggest you conclude your bonding exercise.
Almost there, Chuck growled, laying the final bead of the weld. Okay, release on 3. 1, 2, 3. They both let go. The conduit held, the jet of plasma vanishing. They stood, panting in the oppressive heat, inches apart. The air was electric with more than just stray energy. Chuck met her gaze. The moment stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken thoughts. Then he grinned, breaking the spell. See? A little human ingenuity. She stared a second longer, her amethyst eyes searching his, before she turned and walked out, leaving Chuck alone with the steady hum of the repaired engine and a suddenly racing heart. The Viscard data was on a secure hub on Helios 7, a heavily fortified human military outpost. Getting in through force was impossible.
There is a historical tour for wealthy patrons tomorrow,
Fiona said, studying a holographic schematic of the station she'd acquired from the data chip.
I've sliced the station's manifest. You are Lorik Riggs, a tiresome mining heir with more money than sense. I am your companion, Thea. We are a couple.
Couple? Chuck raised an eyebrow.
Your human tendency for pointless bickering will provide excellent cover,
she stated flatly.
While you are creating a social diversion, I will access a maintenance terminal near the exhibit hall. According to these schematics, we will have a window of exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds.
The next day, Chuck found himself in a ridiculously expensive suit, an arm draped around Fiona, who was stunning in a simple but elegant black dress that did little to hide the warrior's physique beneath. Relax, he whispered as they joined the tour group. You're supposed to look like you're in love with me.
I am projecting an aura of mild disdain mixed with financial dependency. I believe it is more authentic for this persona,
she whispered back without moving her lips. The tour guide droned on about ancient battles and heroic last stands. Fiona gave Chuck a subtle nod. It was time. Darling, Chuck said loudly, his voice echoing in the sterile hall. I'm bored. Oh, this is all so dreadfully dull. Can't we go look at the gift shop? Fiona played her part perfectly.
Lorik, you promised you would show an interest in my family's heritage. My great-uncle served on this very station.
There ridiculous, escalating argument drew stares from the other patrons and the bored-looking guards. While all eyes were on him, Fiona slipped away into a service corridor. It was perfect. Until it wasn't. As Fiona was plunging her data spike into the terminal, a guard appeared at the far end of the corridor, ahead of schedule on his patrol. Chuck saw him over the tour guide's shoulder. He saw the guard's eyes narrow, his posture shift. He had to act. Fiona had just slipped back into the main corridor when Chuck grabbed her. "And another thing!" he shouted, spinning her around to face him. The guard looked over, his expression hardening with suspicion as he started towards them. He was young, his hand drifting towards his sidearm. Before the guard could close the distance, Chuck dipped Fiona low, and then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate, passionate, a full-body press designed to create a scene so awkward, so intensely personal, that no professional would want to get involved. Her lips were soft, hesitant for a fraction of a second, and then, to his utter shock, they responded, her hand coming up to tangle in his hair. The approaching guards stopped dead. This was a domestic dispute of the highest order. With a sigh of profound exasperation, he shook his head, made a subtle move-along gesture to no one in particular, and deliberately turned his back, wanting nothing more to do with the rich couple's drama. The danger past, Chuck should have pulled away. He didn't. The argument had been fake, but the kiss felt like the most honest thing that had happened between them. When he finally broke the kiss, they were both breathless. Her amethyst eyes were wide, her lips slightly parted. He pulled her upright, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. The shouting match forgotten, the guard ignored. The world shrunk to the space between them. The argument started the moment the airlock door of the lucky bastard hissed shut.
That was reckless!
Fiona's voice was a whip crack. She slammed her hand against the bulkhead, the metal ringing with the force of the blow.
You jeopardized the entire mission!
I saved your ass! Chuck shot back, the adrenaline from the heist and the kiss leaving his nerves raw and exposed. There was a guard coming right for you!
You could have created a different diversion, something tactical, something with a predictable outcome.
There wasn't time for tactical. There was only time for chaotic guesswork, and in case you haven't noticed, that's what I do. He stepped into her space, their faces inches apart, the air thick with ozone and unspoken feelings. It worked, didn't it?
Your luck will run out, Val. Your chaos will get us both killed.
My chaos is the only reason you're still alive. She grabbed the front of his jacket and slammed him back against the opposite bulkhead. Her face was a storm of fury and something wild and vulnerable he couldn't name.
I should kill you,
she breathed, her voice shaking with the effort of her control.
You are a disruption, a variable I cannot control.
Chuck stared into her blazing amethyst eyes, seeing the conflict tearing her apart. The commander versus the woman, order versus the chaos he represented. Then do it, he breathed back, his voice low and steady. Her lips trembled, her grip tightened. And then she kissed him. It was a collision, angry and hungry, a desperate, passionate clash of teeth and tongues. Her legendary control shattered into a million pieces. He wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her against the wall, answering her fury with a hunger of his own that had been building since he first laid eyes on her. When they finally broke apart, they were gasping. They didn't speak, couldn't look at each other. The air crackled with the aftershock, thick with everything they had just admitted without saying a word. In the cockpit, the silence was a living thing. The fury had cooled into a fragile, heavy awkwardness. Chuck cleared his throat. So, that was... Don't... She cut him off, her voice quiet but firm. She wouldn't meet his eyes.
Later. First, the data.
The unspoken word hung between them. Later. A promise or a threat. He nodded, grateful for the sense of purpose. They worked side by side, the faint glow of the console illuminating their faces. The Viscar encryption was a nightmare.
It's a fascinating fractal cipher,
Fiona murmured, her fingers flying across the console.
Unbreakable by conventional logic, each layer re-encrypts the one below it based on the attempt to breach the one above.
So we're screwed.
Conventional logic is the Athelian way,
She corrected. A thoughtful look crossed her face.
Your ship's AI, its programming is stochastic, chaotic.
She finally looked at him, her eyes bright with a sudden, brilliant idea.
Athelian security would never anticipate, well, you.
It was the most absurdly unscientific thing Chuck had ever heard. It was perfect. "Lucky," Chuck said, leaning back in his chair. "You heard the lady. Give it a shot."
Analyzing.
The AI replied.
This encryption is a symphony of mathematical perfection. Breaking it would be like adding a happy face to a somber masterpiece of Terran art. A crude defacement of elegant structure.
Can you do it or not?
I can be persuaded to rearrange the notes.
For the next hour, they watched as Lucky assaulted the cipher with pure, weaponized chaos. It added emotional values to data blocks, introduced random variables based on stellar flare patterns, and searched for meaning in dissonant code. Then, a single word flashed on the screen. Decrypted. Rows of text scrolled into view. A video comms log. Guardwin Magnus's face appeared, opposite a gaunt Viscar with slender, multi-jointed limbs and skin like polished obsidian. They laid out the entire plan. False flag attacks on neutral colonies, the destruction of the Vindicator to create a martyr, all to push the galaxy into a full-scale war from which the Viscar would profit immensely. Billions would die. Fiona stared at the screen, her face pale.
We have to stop him.
Chuck looked at her, at the fire of righteous fury that had replaced the shock in her eyes. Yeah, he said, placing his hand over hers on the console. We do. We can't just leak the data, Chuck argued, pacing the small cockpit. Guardwin will brand it as human propaganda. The Viscar will deny everything and bury it under a mountain of credits and lawyers.
You are correct,
Fiona agreed. She turned from the viewport, her expression a mixture of grim purpose and terrifying excitement.
Therefore, we cannot allow them the opportunity to discredit it. Guardwin is scheduled to make a formal address to the entire Imperial fleet in 2 days. He will do it from the fleet's command and control dreadnought, the voice of the Empire.
Chuck felt a cold dread mix with a surge of adrenaline. No, absolutely not.
We will infiltrate the dreadnought,
she continued as if he hadn't spoken.
We'll fight our way to the central communication hub, and during his live address, we will hijack the broadcast and play his treachery for the entire fleet to see.
Chuck stared at her. That's not a plan. That is a suicide note with diagrams.
It is the only way to ensure the truth is seen by everyone, simultaneously.
He ran a hand through his hair. The plan was insane. It was the most ridiculously, gloriously, chaotically human plan he had ever heard, and it had come from the most ordered Athelian he had ever met. He was definitely a bad influence on her. He broke into a slow grin. Hijack the Athelian flagship during a fleet-wide address. It's the stupidest plan I have ever heard.
I am open to alternatives.
Chuck laughed, a short, sharp bark of pure exhilaration. Hell no, I'm in. The diplomatic shuttle was their Trojan horse. Dressed in stolen Athelian officer uniforms, they approached the gargantuan form of the Voice of the Empire, a city-sized behemoth of black metal and glowing energy conduits. "They're hailing us," Chuck said, his hands sweating inside the unfamiliar gloves.
"Put them through,"
Fiona ordered. A crisp, professional Athelian face appeared on the comm screen.
"This is Commander Vendetta,"
Fiona said, her voice pure, undiluted command.
"Priority mission for Admiral Magnus. Clearance code Omega 39er.
The officer paused, his brow furrowing. "One moment, Commander." The screen went blank. "This isn't going to work," Chuck muttered, his heart pounding.
"It will,"
she said under her breath.
"Godwin is arrogant. He would have his techs run security sweeps for military backdoors and high-level command codes. He wouldn't have them check the diagnostic code for the atmospheric recyclers. Code Omega 39er isn't a security clearance. It's a ghost command I wrote into the life support mainframe years ago to allow for emergency overrides."
On screen, the officer returned, his expression smooth once more. "Apologies for the delay, Commander. Clearance confirmed. Proceed to Hangar Bay 3. The moment the ramp lowered, they knew something was wrong. A full platoon of elite Marines was waiting, weapons raised. Guardwin Magnus's face appeared on a giant screen above the hangar. "Fiona," he sneered, "did you really think I wouldn't have your personal ghost codes flagged? You always were predictable. Kill them." The Marines opened fire. "So much for thorough!" Chuck yelled, kicking a supply crate over for cover. Nearby was a locker of emergency EVA gear. "Helmets, now!" They each snatched a helmet, sealing them on just as a plasma bolt vaporized the locker.
"New plan! We move!"
Fiona yelled, already returning fire with a scavenged pulse rifle. It was a running gunfight through sterile silver corridors of the Dreadnought, a perfect, deadly fusion of her strategy and his mayhem. They blasted through the final door and tumbled into the central communication hub. It was a vast, circular room, the walls lined with blinking consoles. On every screen was Godwin Magnus's smug face, his address in progress. "Her death will not be in vain," Godwin was saying, his voice resonating with false grief. "It will be the fire that forges our victory." "Running out of time!" Chuck yelled, sealing the door as the sizzle of a cutting torch began to glow on the other side. "Do your thing!" Fiona threw herself at the master console. Her fingers danced across the interface.
"It's locked me out! Hardwired blocks on every system!"
"Then be more chaotic!" Chuck yelled back, laying down suppressing fire at the weakening door. "Don't break it! Rearrange it!" Her eyes widened in understanding. She dived into the raw data feed, not trying to bypass the security, but poisoning the source itself. She rerouted environmental data, comms chatter, and sensor readings into the broadcast buffer, overloading it with garbage information. She uploaded everything.
"Got it!"
she yelled.
"On your mark!"
The cutting torch sliced through the final section of the door. "Now, Fiona! Light it up!" Chuck roared. He opened fire as the door blew inward. At the same moment, Fiona slammed her fist down on the console. On every screen in the fleet, Godwin's triumphant image flickered, stuttered, and was replaced by his own calm voice discussing casualty projections with a multi-limbed Viscar. The effect was instantaneous. Outside the Dreadnought's viewports, the disciplined formations of the Athelian fleet dissolved into chaos as ships loyal to the old command opened fire on those controlled by Godwin's co-conspirators. A civil war erupted in the vacuum of space. On the main screen, Godwin's face reappeared, contorted with rage.
Vaporize that entire deck! I want nothing left but atoms!
The ship shuddered violently. Red alert klaxons blared.
Time to go!
Chuck yelled as Marines, clad in black armor, began pouring into the room. They were back to back in the center of the room, the air thick with smoke and the smell of burnt circuits. Chuck's pistol clicked empty. Fiona was down to her last energy cell. The dreadnought was tearing itself apart around them, groaning like a dying beast.
Any bright ideas, Commander?
Chuck yelled over the chaos.
We're out of exits!
Fiona, using her innate knowledge of the ship's architecture, scanned their prison, her eyes darting over circuits and support beams. Her eyes widened.
There!
She screamed, pointing at the internal bulkhead to their right.
The schematics! The aft emergency pod bay is through that wall, but the bulkhead is shielded!
Chuck followed her gaze, then looked at a massive power conduit running along the wall, sparks flying from a damaged junction. The insane idea formed in his mind, a perfect marriage of her knowledge and his chaos. "Well," Chuck said, a wild, manic grin spreading across his face. "Ever surf a plasma wave?"
What?
He didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the sputtering conduit.
On my mark, brace for impact!
He yelled, hot-wiring the junction with the butt of his empty pistol. The conduit began to glow, its low hum rising to an unbearable shriek.
What are you doing?
Fiona screamed over the noise.
Improvising!
He roared back, jamming the pistol's handle into the junction, shorting the final connection.
No!
The conduit exploded, not outwards in a chaotic blast, but inwards in a directed wave of pure kinetic force contained for a nanosecond by the ship's magnetic field lines. The blast tore through the weakened bulkhead, blasting them not into space, but into the adjacent compartment, the emergency escape pod bay. The force was stunning. They were thrown across the bay like dolls, slamming into the far wall with bone-jarring force. The bay was still pressurized, but the outer doors were groaning, threatening to blow. They scrambled, bruised and battered into the nearest pod. Chuck slammed his fist on the launch sequence. The pod shot out into the blackness just as the bay doors blew open and the communications hub exploded in a brilliant, silent flower of fire. The escape pod drifted silently. Inside, Chuck and Fiona floated in the zero-G, watching the Athelian fleet tear itself apart. A civil war of fire and light against the backdrop of the stars. They had won. Chuck slumped against the bulkhead, his body screaming with a dozen different kinds of pain. Fiona drifted over to him, her face smudged with soot, a cut bleeding violet on her forehead. She looked more beautiful than ever. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing her cheek. "Still think humans are fragile?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper. Fiona looked at him, her amethyst eyes searching his. The iron vendetta was gone. The Athelian commander was gone. All that was left was the woman he had pulled from a wreck, the woman who had fought beside him, the woman who had kissed him like he was her last chance at life. She didn't answer with words. She leaned in, closing the small distance between them, and pulled him into a deep, possessive kiss. A promise, a beginning. They were the two most wanted people in the galaxy, betrayed by their own people, with no allies, no home, and a list of enemies a mile long. They had nothing but a stolen escape pod and each other, and they had never been more free.